Hey guys, and welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're travelling to a country that does something no other place on Earth can quite manage. Somewhere down in the flat green south, near the Indian border, the land sits at about 59 metres above sea level, warm, humid, thick with elephant grass and the smell of wet soil. And then, if you turn and head north, in the space of roughly 200 kilometres less than the distance between a lot of cities and their nearest airport, that same ground climbs all the way up to 8,849 metres. The top of the planet, the literal ceiling of the world. Nepal contains almost the entire vertical range of the Earth's surface, folded into a country about the size of the American state of Arkansas. Before we get going, I would genuinely love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and tell me your corner of the world, a city, a village, or a bed you have absolutely no intention of leaving. And if these long, slow journeys through history help you drift off, do think about subscribing. It's free, it's quiet, and it keeps the archives lit. So settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your shoulders come down from around your ears. Tonight we're going to build a country from the ground up, quite literally, from the bedrock upward, because before there were kings, or Buddhas, or wars, there was the land itself. And in Nepal, the land isn't just the setting for the story, it is the story. Chapter 1. The Vertical Country. Let's start with a thought experiment. I want you to imagine you could stand at the very southern edge of Nepal and look north, with X-ray vision and no atmosphere getting in the way. What you'd see in front of you is not a landscape. It's a staircase built by giants who had no sense of proportion. It begins as a dead flat plain, warm and green, barely above the level of the sea. Then it rises into low forested hills, then bigger hills, then hills that stopped being hills a long time ago and started being mountains. And then, right at the back, a wall of white so high it scrapes the bottom of the jet stream. All of that, from bottom to top, in a horizontal distance you could cover in a long day's drive. Nowhere else on the planet does the ground climb so far, so fast. Now, to understand why the land does this, we have to go back about 50 million years, which I promise is the furthest back we'll go tonight. Once upon a time, India was not attached to Asia. It was its own continental raft, drifting north across an ancient ocean, minding its own business, and then it hit. Not with a bang, with the geological equivalent of two lorries meeting in extreme slow motion, both refusing to brake. India ploughed into the underbelly of Asia, and having nowhere else to go, the crust between them buckled, crumpled, and heaved upward. Think of sliding two thick rugs across a floor until they meet. The fabric has to go somewhere, so it rucks up into ridges. The rock did exactly that, except the rug was a continent and the ridges are 5 miles high. That crumpling is the Himalaya. Nepal, essentially, is what happens when two continents have a very slow, very permanent argument that neither one is ever going to win. And here's the part that genuinely unsettles me. That argument is still going. India is still shoving north, roughly 2 centimetres a year, about the speed your fingernails grow, and the Himalaya is still rising. But rock does not slide smoothly. It sticks. Pressure builds along a vast underground fault called the main Himalayan thrust, decade after decade, until the stone can't hold any longer and it lets go all at once. That releases an earthquake. On a spring morning in 2015, near the district of Gorkha, roughly 150 kilometres of that fault unlocked in a matter of seconds. Nearly 9,000 people died. The mountains, in other words, are not a finished monument. They are a work in progress, and the progress is occasionally violent. So that's how the staircase got built. Let's walk up it, starting at the bottom. The lowest step is called the Terai, a strip of flat, fertile lowland running along the entire southern border, a spillover of the great Gangetic plain of India. If your mental image of Nepal is nothing but snow and prayer flags, the Terai is going to surprise you. It's hot, it's humid, it grows rice and sugarcane and lentils, and for most of history it was a belt of dense, malarial jungle, so unpleasant that it worked as a natural moat, keeping invaders and empires politely at arm's length. The mosquitoes did what armies could not. Anyone marching up from the plains of India had to cross that fever belt first, and a great many of them simply didn't make it out the other side. Today it's the country's breadbasket, crisscrossed by roads and rice paddies, and home to a huge share of Nepal's people. But for centuries, the Terai's main job was simply being too miserable to conquer. Climb a little higher and you reach the middle of the country, the hills, known locally as the Pahad. And hills is doing some heavy lifting as a word here, because these run from around 800 metres up to 4,000, which in most countries would qualify as a mountain range worth naming. This is the green, terraced heart of Nepal, the postcard you're picturing. Ridges stacked behind ridges, fading from emerald to blue to grey, every slope carved into staircases of farmland by hand, over generations. Most of Nepal's history happened right here, in these folds and valleys, because it was the sweet spot high enough to escape the jungle diseases of the Terai, low enough to actually grow food and raise a family without needing to be part yak. And then, at the top of the staircase, the ground simply gives up on subtlety. This is the Himalaya proper, the highest mountains on Earth, and Nepal keeps most of the trophies. Of the 14 peaks on the entire planet that rise above 8,000 metres, 8 of them stand in Nepal or along its northern border. Say their names slowly, because each one has killed people who came to admire it. Everest, Kanchenjunga, Lhotse, Makalu, Cho Oyu, Dhaulagiri, Manaslu, and Annapurna. That's more than half the world's highest mountains, crammed along the top edge of one modest-sized nation. It's a bit like one small county owning 8 of the world's 10 tallest buildings, except the buildings are made of ice and don't much care whether you survive the visit. And presiding over all of it, of course, is Everest, or Sagarmatha, forehead of the sky, as it's known in Nepali, which is a far better name, and I will not be taking questions. At 8,849 metres, its summit is the single highest point on the surface of the Earth. Up there, the air holds barely a third of the oxygen you're breathing right now. The temperature can sit at 40 below. Winds scream across the top fast enough to pluck a person off their feet. It is, by any honest measure, a place actively trying to kill anything foolish enough to stand on it. The upper reaches even have a nickname among climbers, the death zone, the altitude above which your body has quite literally started to die, cell by cell, simply from being there. And yet every year, hundreds of people actually queue, in a line, on the roof of the world for the privilege. Humans are wonderfully strange. Now, here's a detail that reorganized my whole sense of how this place works. You'd assume the mountains came first and the rivers politely found their way around them. It's the opposite. Nepal's 3 great river systems, the Koshi in the east, the Gandaki in the centre, and the Karnali in the west, are older than the mountains they run through. They were already flowing when the Himalaya was still a low ripple, and as the range rose beneath them, the rivers simply kept soaring downward, holding their ground, cutting through the rising rock like a wire through cheese. Geologists call these antecedent rivers. I call it the single most stubborn thing in all of nature. The mountains grew for 50 million years, and the water just refused to move. And nowhere is that stubbornness more spectacular than the Kali Gandaki Gorge. Picture two of those 8,000-metre giants, Dhaulagiri and Annapurna, standing barely 30 kilometres apart, glaring at each other. And running right down the gap between them, at the very bottom, is a river that has carved the deepest gorge on the planet. Measured from the peaks that flank it, the canyon plunges well over 5,000 metres deeper than the Grand Canyon several times over. Stand at the river's edge and look up, and there is enough mountain above your head to stack a couple of the world's tallest peaks and still have room to spare. And it was all carved patiently by a river that was simply there first and refused to leave. Tucked into the middle hills, there's one particular bowl of flat ground that deserves its own moment, because it's about to become the beating heart of everything we'll talk about in the chapters ahead. The Kathmandu Valley. It's a broad, fertile saucer ringed by green hills, blessed with mild weather and rich soil, and for that reason it became the political and cultural centre of the whole country. But here is the wonderful part. That valley floor, the one that would one day hold palaces and temples and 500,000 people it was, not so long ago in geological terms, the bottom of a lake. I'm not being poetic. A genuine lake, deep and wide, filled that entire valley for hundreds of thousands of years. We know because the soil is made of ancient lake sediment, and buried in it, geologists have found the fossilized bones of creatures that don't exactly scream mountain kingdom, the ancestors of hippos and crocodiles, and even elephants' relatives. Then, at some point, the water found a weak spot in the southern rim of the valley, near a place called Chobar, and drained away through the gap, leaving behind that flat, gorgeous, impossibly fertile floor. There's an old legend that a wandering sage sliced the gorge open with a single stroke of his sword to release the waters. The geology says earthquakes and erosion did it more slowly. Honestly, the sword makes a better story. Now, stacking the entire vertical range of the earth into one country does something remarkable to the weather. Nepal doesn't have a climate, it has all of them at once. Down in the Terai, it's genuinely tropical, steamy, buggy, jungle hot. Climb through the hills and you pass through temperate, then cool, then genuinely cold. And at the top you reach a true Arctic climate of permanent ice and snow, where nothing grows and almost nothing lives. You can travel from the tropics to the Arctic in a single afternoon's climb, sweating at breakfast and shivering by supper, without ever leaving the country or crossing a single border. And laid over all of that is the monsoon. Every summer from around June, warm, wet air sweeps up from the Indian Ocean and slams into that great white wall of mountains, which acts like an enormous rain catcher. The southern slopes get drenched. But, and this is the clever, cruel bit, the far side of the mountains gets almost nothing. All the moisture has already been wrung out before the air ever makes it over the top, so behind the highest peaks lie the rain shadows. High, cold, wind-scoured deserts like the kingdom of Mustang, which sees barely a few 100 millimetres of rain a year, and looks less like Nepal and more like the surface of Mars with better monasteries. Same country, utterly opposite worlds, separated by a single ridgeline. And where the land goes, the wildlife follows. Down in the steamy grasslands of the Terai, in parks like Chitwan, you'll find one-horned rhinos wading through the swamps, wild elephants, long-snouted gharial crocodiles basking on the riverbanks, and Bengal tigers moving like rumours through the tall grass. It is proper full-throated jungle, the kind you'd expect much further south. Nepal's national parks have quietly become one of the great conservation success stories on the planet. The tiger population here has been climbing while it collapses almost everywhere else, which, given how much of history is things going wrong, is a genuinely lovely thing to be able to say out loud. Then climb 10,000 feet and the whole cast of characters swaps out. Up in the high, thin air of the mountains live snow leopards, grey ghosts, so elusive that most researchers who study them spend entire careers without seeing one in the wild. There are red pandas dozing in the rhododendron forests, blue sheep clinging to cliffs that seem to offer nowhere to actually stand, and the Himalayan monal, a pheasant so absurdly iridescent it looks like someone spilled a rainbow and then gave it legs. And weaving through the stories of these mountains is the Yeti, the abominable snowman himself, a legend that every village at altitude will happily tell you about over tea, and which science has politely declined to confirm. From rhinos in the swamp to snow leopards on the roof of the world, all within the borders of one modest country. That is the gift and the burden of building a nation on a staircase. So that's the stage. A country stood up on its end plains at the bottom, the highest mountains on earth at the top, rivers older than the rock, valleys that used to be lakes, and a fault line underneath it all that has never once stopped pushing. Every kingdom, every temple, every war, every wave of people we're about to meet had to make their peace with this vertical, restless, beautiful geography. The mountains kept invaders out. The valleys held the power. The rivers carved the roads. Nothing that happened in Nepal happened in spite of the land. It all happened because of it. And the first people to climb this staircase and call it home are exactly where we're headed next. Chapter 2. Cowherds, Kings, and the Boy Who Woke Up. So picture the valley floor again, that old lake bed, drained through the Chobar Gorge, sitting there flat and rich and quietly waiting. Land that fertile doesn't stay empty for long. And the first people we know of who wandered down into that bowl, according to Nepal's oldest stories, weren't warriors or priests or kings with grand plans. They were cowherds. Genuinely. Before there were dynasties or temples or armies, the legends say Nepal belonged to a family of men who followed their cattle around and called it a government. It's a wonderfully humble way to start a national epic. Most civilizations open with a god or a flood. Nepal opens with livestock. These were the Gopala, the cowherd dynasty. And I have to be honest with you, up front we have basically no hard evidence they existed. Not a coin, not a wall, not a scrap of writing. What we have is a set of much later chronicles, written centuries after the fact, insisting that the very first rulers of the Kathmandu Valley were pastoralists who grazed their herds on that drained lake bed and slowly turned it into something like a settled world. They're said to have ruled for roughly 500 years, which is an astonishing run for a dynasty nobody can prove was real. But that's the thing about legends. They don't need receipts. And you can see why the story took the shape it did. If you're a people living in a green Himalayan valley where cattle are wealth and milk is life, of course your founding myth stars a cowherd. It's the same instinct that makes a fishing village tell stories about a fisherman who talked to the sea. The Gopala legend isn't really about herding at all. It's a community looking back across an unknowable stretch of time and saying, we were here first, and we were ordinary, and we made this place with our hands. Honestly, as origin myths go, it's got a certain quiet dignity to it. The cowherds, so the story goes, were eventually replaced by the buffalo herders, the Mahaishapala dynasty, because apparently early Nepal ran entirely on livestock-based regime change. And then came the group that actually starts to feel like history, the Kirata. These are the first people in Nepal you can point to with any real confidence and say, yes, they were here, they were powerful, and their descendants are still walking around today. The chronicles name their first king as Yalamba, and they claim he seized power by defeating the last of the buffalo herder kings. which I suppose is the ancient equivalent of a hostile takeover in the dairy sector. Now, Yalamba comes wrapped in one absolutely magnificent piece of legend. According to tradition, he didn't just rule a Himalayan valley, he turned up at the Mahabharata, the great Sanskrit war epic, the one with gods and chariots and battles that reshaped the cosmos. The story says Yalamba travelled all the way to the plains to watch the fighting, curious which side would win, and that his sheer power made the gods a little nervous. It is almost certainly not true. But think about what it tells you. The Kirata were remembering themselves as players on the grandest stage in the entire subcontinent, not a backwater, not an afterthought, a people who showed up when history's biggest war was being fought. And here's the part that grounds all of it. The Kirata aren't gone. Their descendants are the Rai and the Limbu peoples of eastern Nepal, communities who have lived in these hills for something like 2,500 years and are very much still here with their own languages, their own shamans, their own deep memory of a time when their ancestors ran the valley. When you read that 28 or 29 Kirata kings ruled for over 1,000 years, the numbers are shaky and the chronicles disagree wildly. But underneath the fuzzy math is a solid truth. A single cultural thread stretches from those semi-legendary kings straight through to living people today. That's not mythology. That's continuity you can shake hands with. But while the Kirata were up in their valley doing whatever Kirata kings did, something was about to happen down in the lowlands in that flat, humid Terai belt we talked about last time that would end up mattering more than every dynasty in this entire chapter combined. In a garden, near a town called Lumbini, around the 6th century before the Common Era, a woman was travelling back to her parents' home to give birth, the way custom demanded, and she didn't quite make it, so she stopped in a grove of trees, and there, under the branches, she had a son. The woman was Queen Maya Devi, and the boy was Siddhartha Gautama, born, by the traditional reckoning, around the year 563, before the Common Era. His family were the Shakya, a small ruling clan in the Himalayan foothills, which meant young Siddhartha grew up as a prince, comfortable, sheltered, wanting for nothing. And that's precisely the point of everything that follows. Because this is a boy who had it all, every pleasure a life could offer, and who looked at that life one day and felt a bottomless dissatisfaction he couldn't explain. The story of the Buddha isn't the story of a poor man finding hope. It's the story of a rich one discovering that having everything wasn't the same as being at peace. I'm not going to walk you through his whole life here. That's a story that outgrew Nepal a very long time ago. But the short version is this. He left the palace. He gave up the wealth, the family, the comfort, all of it, and he spent years wandering as a homeless seeker, half starving himself, trying to figure out why human beings suffer and whether anything could be done about it. And eventually, sitting under a tree far to the south in what's now India, he worked something out, or felt he did. Buddha isn't a name, it's a title. It means, more or less, the one who woke up. And a boy born in a Nepali garden woke up into a philosophy that would go on to shape the inner lives of hundreds of millions of people. And this is the part worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes how you see the whole country. Nepal is not a footnote in the story of Buddhism. It is the opening line. The single most influential spiritual figure to come out of Asia, a man whose ideas reshaped China and Japan and Tibet and Sri Lanka, and eventually meditation apps on phones in California took his first breath on Nepali soil. Ask a Nepali where the Buddha was born, and you'll get an answer delivered with the kind of quiet, unshakable pride that comes from being right about something the whole world occasionally gets wrong. He was born in Lumbini. Lumbini is in Nepal, full stop, and every year pilgrims from across the planet walk that same ground to stand where a queen once stopped to rest. Here's the detail that I find genuinely staggering. For a long, long time, the exact spot where he was born was more or less lost remembered in scripture, sure, but not physically pinned down. Then, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, one of the most powerful emperors the subcontinent ever produced came to Lumbini in person. This was Ashoka, the Mauryan ruler who'd conquered half of India, been horrified by the bloodshed he'd caused, and converted to Buddhism. And he did something wonderful. He put up a stone pillar and had it inscribed to mark the spot a message, carved in stone, saying flatly that here, in this place, the Buddha was born. It is, if you think about it, the ancient world's version of a plaque. And then that pillar was swallowed by time, buried, forgotten, lost under centuries of soil and undergrowth, until 1896, when a Nepali general and a German archaeologist dug it back up and read what was written on it. There it was, in the old Brahmi script, the emperor's words still perfectly legible after more than 2,000 years, a beloved of the gods king, telling you exactly where you were standing. Imagine being the person who brushed the dirt off that stone and realized what it said. A message deliberately left for the future by a man who'd been dead for millennia, finally reaching the readers he'd carved it for. That's Lumbini. That's why it matters. Nepal is the ground where the Buddha entered the world. Right, so while all of that reverberates outward across Asia, back up in the Kathmandu Valley, the political story finally sharpens into focus because we've reached the point where people started writing things down. Enter the Licchavi. Sometime around the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, this dynasty took control of the valley, and with them, Nepal steps out of legend and into recorded history. How do we know so much more about them than the cowherds and the Kirata? Simple, they left inscriptions. Hundreds of them, carved into stone, dated, detailed, and scattered across the valley like the ancient world's filing system. Over 200 Licchavi inscriptions survive, most of them in elegant Sanskrit, and they are a historian's dream. Land grants, water taxes, temple donations, royal genealogies, rules about who owed what to whom. It's the unglamorous machinery of a functioning state, frozen in stone, and it tells us these weren't rough tribal chiefs, they were administrators running a genuinely sophisticated kingdom. The oldest of them, and the one everyone points to, sits at the temple of Prithvi Narayan on a hilltop east of Kathmandu. It's a pillar raised by King Manadeva in the year 464, and it's the earliest securely dated inscription in all of Nepal. The moment the country's history stops being a rumour and starts being a record. And they didn't just keep records, they made beautiful things. The Licchavi centuries are when the Kathmandu Valley first became the workshop. It's famous as today a place where stone and bronze and wood were coaxed into some of the finest religious art in Asia. The temple of Prithvi Narayan, where that oldest inscription stands, is covered in carvings of extraordinary craft, and the sculptors of this era produced serene stone gods and gleaming metal deities that people still travel across the world to see. This is the moment the newer artistic tradition, the one that would eventually build the wooden palaces and golden temples of the medieval valley, gets its start. 1,000 years before Kathmandu became a name on a trekker's itinerary, it was already a city of artists. And the Licchavi didn't just govern, they got rich, because of exactly where they were sitting. Remember the geography. That valley is a natural crossroads, tucked into the one part of the Himalaya where you can plausibly move goods between the Indian plains and the Tibetan plateau. So the Licchavi turned themselves into the middlemen of the mountains. Merchants, pilgrims and pack trains moved through their territory carrying textiles and spices and metalwork north, and Tibetan goods south, and the valley taxed and fed and housed all of it. This was the making of Kathmandu as a trading hub, a role it would hold, in one form or another, for the next 1,000-odd years. Location, it turns out, really is everything. The trade carried more than goods, though. It carried ideas, and this is where one Nepali princess quietly changes the religious map of an entire region. Near the end of the Licchavi era, a powerful ruler named Amshuverma, a sharp administrator who governed in the early 600s, strengthened those trade routes north into Tibet, and then sealed the relationship the old-fashioned way. He married his daughter Brikuti to the king of Tibet, Songtsen Gampo, and Brikuti carried her Buddhism with her over the mountains. She's remembered, alongside a Chinese princess, as one of the women who brought the faith into Tibet so revered that Tibetans came to honour her as a living form of the goddess Tara, a girl from the Kathmandu Valley, helping to seed a religion across the roof of the world. So look at what this valley has become by the end of the Licchavi centuries, a place with a written history, a thriving trans-Himalayan trade, exquisite stone temples, and a religious influence radiating out in every direction. It has travelled an enormous distance from those legendary cow herds grazing an empty lake bed, but nothing here is finished. The Licchavi will fade, the Thakuri will rise in their place, and the valley is about to enter a long, glittering, gloriously complicated stretch of history where art and architecture and royal ambition collide like nowhere else on earth. The kingdoms are about to get serious. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Chapter 3. 3 cities, 1 obsession. So the Licchavis handed off their stone inscriptions and their exquisite art, and you might reasonably expect the next chapter of Nepal's story to pick up the momentum and run with it. It does not. What comes next is roughly 3 centuries that historians politely call the transitional period, and less politely call the dark period, which is the academic way of admitting they genuinely aren't sure what happened. The Thakuri kings ruled through here, from around 880 onward, and the honest truth is the records go quiet. Not dramatically quiet, just the ordinary quiet of a place where nobody was carving their achievements into pillars anymore, and the paperwork, such as it was, mostly rotted. Here's the one detail from the Thakuri stretch that's genuinely worth holding on to, because it tells you everything about the era. They practiced something called Dvairaja, which translates to two-king rule, 2 monarchs sharing the throne, governing different chunks of the kingdom at the same time. Now, on paper, power sharing sounds mature and civilized, the sort of thing a modern management consultant would put on a slide. In practice, it meant the kingdom spent a lot of energy figuring out whose turn it was to be in charge, which is exactly as stable as it sounds. The valley drifted. Trade still trickled along the old routes between India and Tibet. Temples still stood. Life went on in the slow rhythm of a place waiting for its next act. But nobody built anything you'd write home about, and nobody wrote much down either. And then, at the very end of it, a new name shows up in the record, and the whole story snaps back into focus. The name is Malla, and I want you to sit with that word for a second, because it's one of the great accidental jokes of Nepali history. Malla in Sanskrit means wrestler, not king, not lord, not divine appointed ruler of the sacred valley. Wrestler. The story goes that the founder, a man called Arideva, was at a wrestling match when word arrived that his son had been born, and he was so taken with the sport that he simply adopted the title on the spot and passed it down to his entire dynasty. So the family that would rule the Kathmandu Valley for the next 6 centuries that would build some of the most delicate, refined, jaw-droppingly beautiful architecture in Asia, named themselves after guys grappling in the dirt. History does this sometimes. It has no sense of occasion. Arideva, also called Arimala, took the throne around 1201, and the dynasty he started would last, in one form or another, until the late 1700s. That's an astonishing run. To put it in perspective, that's longer than the entire history of the United States, twice over, with a few decades to spare. But the early going was rough. This was not a smooth ascent to glory. The first stretch of Malla rule was messy, contested, and periodically interrupted by the kind of catastrophe that makes you wonder if the valley was cursed. Because in 1255, the ground moved. A massive earthquake struck the Kathmandu Valley, and the scale of it is hard to overstate. It's estimated that around a third of the entire population of the valley died. A third. Try to actually picture that. Every third person you know gone in an afternoon. The king himself, a man named Abhaya Malla, was killed. Homes flattened, temples cracked open, whole neighbourhoods reduced to rubble and dust. And this is a theme that never really leaves Nepal's story, so it's worth naming now. This is one of the most seismically violent places on the planet, and every golden age you're about to hear about was built, quite literally, on ground that could betray it at any moment. They kept building anyway. That's kind of the point. For a while after the quake, things stayed unsettled. Rival claimants, brief reigns, the general chaos of a kingdom that couldn't quite decide who was running it. The early Malla period is a bit of a blur of names that flicker in and out. But then, near the end of the 1300s, a genuinely consequential figure arrives, and he is exactly the kind of person a wobbly kingdom needs. His name was Jayasthiti Malla, and he was, by temperament, an organiser, not a conqueror in the flashy sense, though he did pull the fractured valley back together. His real weapon was administration. Paperwork. Rules. The man loved a good rule. Jayasthiti Malla ruled from roughly 1382 to 1395, and in that relatively short window he did something that outlasted everything else he touched. He codified the law. He took the loose, tangled social fabric of the valley and formalized it into a rigid caste system, sorting the population into something like 64 distinct groups, each with its assigned occupation, its rank, its rituals, its place. Weavers here, priests there. Farmers, metal workers, oil pressers, sweepers, all slotted into a hierarchy that governed who you could marry, what work you'd do, and where you stood in the eyes of everyone else. And here's the part that lands hardest. That system he built in the 14th century still shapes Nepali society today, 600 years later. You draft a good rule book, apparently, and it just refuses to die. Now, I'm not going to pretend the caste system was a charming quirk. It was a machine for locking people into place, and its consequences are still being reckoned with in Nepal right now. But from a purely historical standpoint, you have to sit with the strangeness of it. One administrator, in a small Himalayan valley, wrote a social order so durable it survived dynasties, invasions, revolutions, and the arrival of the internet. Most legislation is lucky to survive a change of government. This guy wrote something that outlived the concept of monarchy itself. With the valley stabilized and organized, the Malla kingdom finally had room to breathe, and for a few generations it flourished. The peak of that unity came under a king named Yaksha Malla, who ruled from around 1428 to 1482. Under Yaksha Malla, the kingdom was whole, prosperous, and generous to its artists. He expanded the borders, he patronized the craftsmen, and he presided over what should have been the beginning of a long, stable, golden age. everything was going beautifully. The kingdom was united, the treasury was full, the temples were rising. Which, if you've been paying any attention to how these stories work, means something was about to go spectacularly wrong. What went wrong was love, or fairness, depending on how charitably you read it. Yaksha Malla, rather than naming a single heir and letting the others sulk, decided to divide his kingdom among his children. And so, on his death, the unified Kathmandu Valley shattered into 3 separate, sovereign, and increasingly competitive city kingdoms. Kathmandu, Patan, also called Lalitpur, the city of beauty, and Bhaktapur, sometimes Budgaon, the city of devotees. 3 crowns where there had been one. 3 royal courts, 3 treasuries, 3 sets of ambitions, all packed into a valley you could walk across in a day. And you'd think this would be a disaster. 3 rival kingdoms crammed shoulder to shoulder, squabbling over trade routes and prestige and the occasional bit of territory. Politically, honestly, it kind of was a disaster, and it planted the seed of everything that eventually undid the Mallas. But culturally it was rocket fuel, because when you've got 3 kings living within sight of each other, each one absolutely determined to outshine the other 2, they don't compete with armies. Not mostly. They compete with buildings, with temples, with art. It became the most beautiful arms race in human history, and the ammunition was carved wood and gilded copper. Here's how it played out. One king builds a magnificent temple in his palace square. The king 1 town over sees it, grinds his teeth, and immediately commissions something taller, more intricate, more dazzling. The 3rd king, refusing to be left out, does the same. Rinse, repeat, for 200 years. The result is the 3 Durbar squares, the royal palace complexes at the heart of each city, and they are, without exaggeration, among the most extraordinary concentrations of art and architecture anywhere on earth. This is the golden age of newer craftsmanship, the artistic tradition of the valley's indigenous people, and it reached heights during this rivalry that it had never touched before, and arguably never touched again. Let me try to put you inside one of these squares. You're standing on brick paving worn smooth by centuries of feet. Around you rise the pagodas, those multi-tiered temples with their roofs stacked one above the other, each tier smaller than the last, sweeping up toward the sky. The struts holding up those roofs are carved wood, and when you look closely you realize every single one is a sculpture, deities and demons and dancers and, yes, some carvings so frankly explicit that guidebooks tend to describe them with a nervous cough. The windows are lattice work, so fine it looks like lace made of timber. The doorways are framed in beaten copper, gilded gold, glinting in the thin mountain light. Great stone lions guard the steps. Bronze deities sit serene in their alcoves, hands frozen mid-blessing for 600 years. And the astonishing thing is the scale of it, because this isn't one showpiece surrounded by ordinary buildings. It's block after block after block, an entire city built to this standard, where even the water fountains are carved masterpieces. Nobody here was phoning it in. The showpieces are almost too much to list, but a couple deserve their moment. In Bhaktapur stands the Nyatapola temple, 5 stories of pagoda climbing about 100 feet into the air, the tallest of its kind in Nepal, built in the early 1700s by a king named Bhupatindra Malla. It has stood through multiple catastrophic earthquakes and simply refused to fall. Nearby is the palace of 55 windows, a stretch of dark carved timber so ornate it looks less like a building and more like something grown. These weren't just places of worship or power. They were a city's argument for its own greatness, made permanent in wood and stone. And the craftsmen who built all this weren't anonymous. The greatest of them became legend, and the greatest of the greats was a man named Araniko. Born in Patan, he was a prodigy, a master of newer Buddhist art while he was still young. And his reputation travelled so far that in the mid-1200s an invitation arrived from the single most powerful man on the planet, Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor, the grandson of Genghis, ruler of the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, wanted Nepali artists, and Araniko led a delegation of 80 of them north, first to Tibet, then deep into China itself. And this is the detail that genuinely delights me. Araniko didn't just visit the Mongol court, he conquered it, artistically. He rose to become the emperor's chief architect, and in 1278 he built the Great White Pagoda in Beijing, a structure that still stands today. A boy from a valley in the Himalayas took the pagoda style, that stacked, tiered, upward-reaching form, and carried it into the heart of China, where it helped shape the visual language of temples across East Asia. Think about the reach of that. The next time you picture a classic Chinese or Japanese pagoda in your mind, there's a thread running from that image all the way back to a newer workshop in medieval Nepal. That's not a small footnote. That's one of the most beautiful cultural exports in history. There's one more thing that makes this era so distinct, and it's easy to miss because it's so seamlessly woven in. Walk through any of these cities and you'll notice something odd about the religion. A Hindu temple sits beside a Buddhist monastery, and nobody seems bothered. The same family will worship at both. The same festival will honour deities from both traditions. In the Kathmandu Valley, Hinduism and Buddhism didn't so much coexist as blend, quietly and completely, into a single living practice where the boundaries you'd expect simply dissolved. The Mallas were Hindu kings, but their art and their cities are saturated with Buddhist devotion, and neither side found that a contradiction. It's one of the most genuinely peaceful religious arrangements you'll find anywhere. So there it is, 3 little kingdoms packed into one valley, spending 2 centuries trying to out-beautify each other and accidentally producing one of the great artistic golden ages of the medieval world. It's a wonderful story. It's also, if you step back, a fragile one, because all that competitive energy, all that rivalry, all those resources poured into taller temples and finer carvings, it left the 3 kingdoms exactly where 3 squabbling neighbours always end up. Distracted, divided, and utterly unprepared for the moment, someone from outside the valley looked down at all that gleaming wealth and thought, quietly, I could take that. His name was Prithvi Narayan Shah, and he was already on his way. Chapter 4. The Yam Between 2 Boulders. So let's talk about the man who was already on his way. Because here's the thing about Prithvi Narayan Shah, he wasn't some vast imperial warlord with a horde at his back. He was the king of Gorkha, a scrappy little hill state perched to the west of the valley, the kind of place you could walk across in a day if your knees held out. Gorkha had stone, terraced fields, stubborn people, and not much else. It was not, on paper, a launch pad for empire. But Prithvi Narayan had spent his youth staring east at those 3 glittering Malla cities, watching all that wealth and all that art and all that squabbling, and he'd come to a very simple conclusion. 3 rich kings who hated each other were, functionally, one giant unguarded treasure, and he intended to collect. He took the Gorkha throne around 1743, still barely into his 20s, and he did something almost nobody in a hurry ever does. He waited. He studied the valley like a man casing a bank. He walked its trade routes disguised, counted its forts, learned which passes fed it and which ones could be pinched shut. And what he figured out was the valley's one great weakness. It was rich because it sat on the trade road between India and Tibet, and everything it needed flowed in along a handful of mountain arteries. Cut those, and the golden cities would slowly, quietly begin to starve. And it wasn't just food. The valley grew fat, reselling goods that moved between the Indian plains and Tibet cloth going up, salt and gold and wool coming down, and every merchant caravan paid a toll to somebody in Kathmandu for the privilege. Strangle that flow, and you don't just make people hungry, you make them poor, and a poor city is a nervous city. So Prithvi Narayan built forts on the ridges around the valley rim like a man slowly tightening a noose, seizing the high passes one at a time. No dramatic charge required, just patience and a chokehold. It was less a war plan than a very long, very cruel game of holding your thumb over someone's straw. But patience only gets you so far, and eventually you have to actually fight somebody. That somebody was Kirtipur, a fortified town on a ridge, small, proud, and absolutely furious about being invaded. And Kirtipur handed the Gorkhas one of the great humiliations of the campaign. They attacked, they got thrown back. Prithvi Narayan's trusted commander, Kalu Pandey, was killed. They attacked again, thrown back again, and this time the king's own brother caught an arrow in the face. 3 times they came for that little ridge town, and 3 times Kirtipur said, essentially, absolutely not. For a man building a legend of unstoppable destiny, this was not a great look. When Kirtipur finally did fall exhausted, besieged, promised mercy if they'd only lay down their arms, Prithvi Narayan showed the world exactly what happened when you cost him that much. He had the town's leading men killed, and then, in one of the single most notorious acts in Nepali history, he ordered his soldiers to cut off the noses and lips of nearly every man in Kirtipur. They collected the severed noses in sacks and weighed them. The one mercy, if you can call it that, was an exemption for anyone who could play a wind instrument, presumably because a flautist with no lips is just wasted talent. He even renamed the place, briefly, to something meaning Town of Cut Noses. It was terror as public policy, a message screamed across the valley. Surrender is cheaper than resistance. And it worked. Because after Kirtipur, the valley's nerves started to go. Which brings us to the single most on-brand moment in the entire conquest, and honestly one of my favourite stories in all of Nepali history. In 1768, Kathmandu was celebrating Indra Jatra, the great festival where the whole city drinks, dances, parades the living goddess through the streets, and generally loses its collective mind for several joyous days. The wine was flowing, the music was going, nobody was watching the gates. And Prithvi Narayan Shah, who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of opening, simply walked his army in through 3 points of the city while everyone was too busy partying to notice an invasion was underway. Picture the poor Malla king, Jaya Prakash Malla, realizing mid-festival that the soldiers filling his capital are not, in fact, part of the parade. There's a story probably too good to be entirely true, but let's enjoy it anyway that Prithvi Narayan sat himself down on the royal dais during the festivities and accepted the ceremonial blessing meant for the Malla king. As if the transfer of power were just another item on the programme, Jaya Prakash fled. Kathmandu had fallen not to a heroic siege but to bad crowd control. Within a year, the other cities followed Patan that same season, and stubborn Bhaktapur in 1769. The 300-year Malla Golden Age ended not with a bang, but with a hangover. And here's where Prithvi Narayan turns out to be far more than a clever thug with a nose collection habit. Because he didn't just conquer the valley, he had a vision for what to do with it. He moved his capital to Kathmandu and started stitching dozens of little hill principalities into a single thing. a country, an idea that had never really existed before. This is the moment modern Nepal is actually born, and he understood, with genuinely startling clarity, the fundamental problem his new nation would face forever. He looked north at the vast Qing Chinese Empire sitting on Tibet, and south at the swelling British in India, and he described his kingdom with a phrase every Nepali schoolchild still knows by heart. Nepal, he said, was a yam between two boulders, which is a wonderfully vivid way of saying, we are a soft thing wedged between two very heavy things, and if either of them rolls, we're paste. In his old age, he dictated a set of instructions to his heirs, the Divya Upadesh, the Divine Counsel, and it reads less like royal poetry and more like a hard-nosed survival manual. Keep peace with both giants. Play them off against each other. Never lean too hard toward one. Distrust foreign merchants, because trade is how empires get their foot in your door. And, my favourite piece of advice, keep your own courtiers on a tight leash because, he warned, if you let them run wild, they will devour the state from the inside. Hold on to that last one. It's going to matter enormously in about 70 years. Prithvi Narayan died in 1775, and you might expect the whole thing to fall apart without its architect. It didn't. His successors caught the empire-building fever and kept going, and the Gorkhali war machine turned out to be one of the most formidable in the region. They pushed east until they slammed into Sikkim, and west along the entire spine of the Himalaya, into Kumaon, into Garhwal, rolling up hill kingdom after hill kingdom. At its peak in the early 1800s, the Gorkha Empire stretched something like 1,500 kilometres along the mountains, from the Teesta River in the east all the way to the edge of Punjab in the west. From one stony little hill state, in a couple of generations, to a sprawling Himalayan superpower spanning most of the mountain range's southern face. Not bad for a place you could walk across before lunch and still be home in time for dinner. But an expanding empire is a machine that has to keep eating, and eventually every mouthful is somebody else's dinner. In the west, the Gorkhas finally met men as hard and cunning as themselves, the mountain Rajas and, crucially, Ranjit Singh's rising Sikh empire. At the fortress of Kangra, the Gorkhali advanced ground to a bloody halt and got shoved back across the Sutlej. For the first time, the yam had bumped into a boulder that pushed back, and in the south, they kept nibbling at the flat, fertile lowland strip called the Terai grazing land, farmland, tax revenue which happened to be territory the British East India Company also considered very much theirs. Two aggressive, expanding powers sharing a long and vaguely defined border, both convinced they were in the right. You can see where this is going. Where it was going was war. In late 1814, after the usual round of failed negotiations and mutual accusations over who really owned which patch of jungle, the British declared war on Nepal, and the company was feeling extremely confident. They'd been steamrolling Indian kingdoms for decades. They had more men, more guns, and more money than this mountain kingdom could possibly muster. They marched into the hills expecting a quick, tidy little colonial spanking. What they got instead was one of the nastiest, most humbling wars the East India Company ever fought. A war that taught the British Empire a lesson it would remember with a certain grudging affection for the next 2 centuries. The lesson had a name, and the name was Nalapani. It was a small hill fort near Dehradun, held by a young commander called Balbhadra Kunwar with a garrison of around 600 people, and here's the gut punch. Only about 400 of them were actual fighting men. The rest were women and children. The British rolled up with vastly superior numbers, led by a swashbuckling general named Gillespie who'd made his name in bigger, easier wars. Gillespie ordered a frontal assault on the first day. Gillespie was shot dead on the first day, cut down while waving his men forward. The British attacked again, repulsed, and again repulsed. This tiny fort, absurdly outnumbered, simply would not break. So the British did the coldly logical thing. They stopped trying to storm it and cut off its water instead. And this is the image that stuck in the British imagination forever. Inside that fort, people were dying of thirst. The wounded were rotting, and Balbhadra still refused to surrender. When it was finally truly hopeless down to around 70 survivors, he didn't raise a white flag. He gathered what was left of his people and simply charged straight out through the enemy lines, hacking a path through with those short, heavy, wickedly curved knives the Gorkhas carried. The kukri. The British walked into the captured fort and found it full of the dead and the maimed, and the story goes that among the last to fall was a wounded Gorkhali, who offered water by a British soldier, took the drink, thanked him, and died. Something shifted in how the British thought about these mountain people. They'd expected savages and found soldiers with a code of honour that put their own to shame. You don't forget an enemy like that. You start wondering how to get them on your side. The war dragged on into 1816, and the British eventually did win not through courage but through logistics, which is how the British usually won. A methodical general named Ochterlony literally built roads through the hills to drag his heavy cannon into position, and at the Battle of Makwanpur he finally cracked the Gorkhali defence and put a clear path to Kathmandu. Faced with British artillery in their heartland, the Nepalis made peace. The Treaty of Sugauli stripped Nepal of nearly a third of its territory, the whole western sweep of conquests, chunks of the Terai, the reach towards Sikkim. Everything Prithvi Narayan's heirs had bled for in the west, gone with a signature. It was, by any measure, a defeat. And yet, here is the thing that makes Nepal genuinely extraordinary. The yam got squeezed. Hard, but it never got swallowed. Nepal was never colonized. No British governor, no Union Jack over Kathmandu, no century of imperial rule like almost every neighbour endured. Prithvi Narayan's paranoid little survival manual had, in the end, worked. Nepal stayed a boulder-wedged yam, bruised but sovereign, and the war handed the country its most enduring export, because the British were so shaken by how the Gorkhas fought that they immediately started recruiting them, and the Gurkha soldier became a legend that still serves in the British, Indian, and other armies to this very day. Nepal lost a war and won an identity. But back home in Kathmandu, victory that felt like defeat left a bitter, festering wound. The kings were young and weak, the treasury was gutted, and the royal court was now packed with ambitious noble families who'd learned exactly how much power was up for grabs. Remember that old warning, keep your courtiers on a leash, or they'll devour the state? Well, the leash was off. The courtiers were circling, and in the shadowy corridors of the Kathmandu palace, a young, ruthless, spectacularly cunning man was watching all of it, waiting for the knives to come out. They were about to. Chapter 5. The Family That Ate the State. Right, so the knives came out, and when they finally did, on a warm September night in 1846, they came out all at once in a courtyard, in the dark, in a bloodbath so efficient it basically rewrote the country in a single evening. Remember that ruthless young man we left lurking in the palace shadows at the end of the last chapter? His name was Jung Bahadur Kunwar, and he had been watching the noble factions of Kathmandu circle each other for years, waiting, calculating, taking careful mental notes on exactly who would need to die and in what order. Most people, when they daydream about power, imagine a promotion. Jung Bahadur imagined an armoury full of corpses, He was, we should be clear, extremely good at this. Here's how it went down. There was a man named Gagan Singh, who was the Queen's favourite in the specific eyebrow-raising sense that Nepali court gossip spent decades enjoying, and he was, for all practical purposes, running the government from behind the throne. Then one night, Gagan Singh was shot dead on the balcony of his own house. Nobody knew who did it, though everybody had opinions. The Queen, a formidable woman named Raja Lakshmi, absolutely lost it. She summoned the entire political establishment, every general, minister, courtier, and palace official in Kathmandu, to assemble immediately at the Kot, the palace armoury beside Hanuman Doka, in the middle of the night, which, if you've ever received a work email marked urgent, all hands, come now, you'll recognise as the universal sign that something has gone very wrong. And waiting at the cot, already there, already positioned, already suspiciously ready with his loyal regiments, was Jung Bahadur. Funny that. He gave a simple order to his men: let everyone in, but let no one out. Not without his say-so. So the most powerful people in the kingdom filed into a stone courtyard, and the doors closed behind them, and then the accusations started flying about who had murdered Gagan Singh, and tempers flared, and swords came out, and within a couple of hours somewhere between 30 and 40 of Nepal's leading nobles were dead on the flagstones, including the sitting Prime Minister Fateh Jung Shah. The rival clans that had dominated Nepali politics for generations, the Pandas and the Basniats and the rest, were essentially exterminated in one night. That's the Kot massacre. It's the moment the entire country changed hands. Now, did Jung Bahadur plan every second of that chaos, or did he simply have the reflexes of a shark in a swimming pool full of bleeding accountants? Historians still argue about it. What's not in doubt is what happened next. Within days, the grateful or terrified Queen appointed him Prime Minister. And just to make sure no lingering rivals got any ideas, there was a follow-up bit of housekeeping a few weeks later, the Bandarkal massacre, where the remaining opposition was tidily disposed of. Jung Bahadur then did the Queen the discourtesy of exiling her too, once she'd served her purpose. He was not a man who left loose ends. He was more the sort of man who set the loose ends on fire and then salted the ashes. But seizing power is the easy part. Any thug with a courtyard and a good sense of timing can manage a massacre. Keeping power and passing it to your family for 100 years, that takes real architecture. And this is where we finally pay off a warning we planted way back at the start of Nepal's unification story. Remember Prithvi Narayan Shah, the founding king, and his famous piece of advice, the Divya Upadesh, where he warned that if you let the courtiers grow too powerful, they will devour the state. Well, Jung Bahadur read that warning, and instead of heeding it, he treated it as an instruction manual. He didn't just devour the state, he kept the royal family alive as decorative garnish on the plate. Here's the genius, if you can call it that, of the system he built. He didn't overthrow the Shah kings. He didn't need to. He just made the office of Prime Minister hereditary, his family's permanent property, and reduced the actual king to a sacred, ceremonial figure who was trotted out for religious festivals and then quietly filed away in the palace like a very expensive umbrella you're afraid to lose. The king reigned. The Rana Prime Minister ruled. Jung Bahadur even secured a fancy new title, Rana, dressing his family up as descendants of noble Rajput warrior kings, because if you're going to steal a country, you might as well give yourself a good surname while you're at it. He also invented one of the strangest succession systems in political history. Power didn't pass from father to son, the normal way. It passed brother to brother, sideways along the row of siblings, and then down to their sons in strict order of age. On paper, this was clever. It meant a grown, experienced man always inherited, never a vulnerable child. In practice, it meant the extended Rana family was a seething nest of ambitious cousins and uncles, all mentally ranking each other by proximity to the throne, occasionally accelerating the timeline with a well-placed assassination. Imagine a family WhatsApp group where everyone is technically next in line and everyone is armed. It was less a line of succession than a very slow, very polite civil war conducted over 90 years of awkward dinners. Now, 4 years into running Nepal, Jung Bahadur did something genuinely unprecedented, and to his enormous credit, genuinely bold. In 1850, he got on a boat and sailed to Europe. This does not sound like a big deal until you understand that for a high-caste Hindu of the era, crossing the ocean, the Kalapani, the dark waters, was a profound religious taboo that could cost you your caste, your status, your entire spiritual standing. He did it anyway. He became the first ruler from all of South Asia to visit Europe, arriving in Southampton in the spring of 1850 with 2 of his brothers and a glittering entourage, and proceeded to become an absolute sensation in Victorian England. The British had no idea what to do with him, and they loved it. Here was this exotic Himalayan prince, draped in emeralds and diamonds the size of pigeon eggs, being paraded through London, taken to the opera, introduced to Queen Victoria, and then shipped across the Channel to be gawked at by Louis Napoleon in Paris. But Jung Bahadur wasn't there for the sightseeing. He was there to take measurements. He walked through British arsenals and factories and dockyards doing hard, cold arithmetic in his head about exactly how much military muscle these industrialized Europeans could bring to bear. And he came home in 1851, having reached one iron conclusion. Nepal could never beat the British in a straight fight, so Nepal would befriend them instead. It was pragmatism dressed as diplomacy, and it kept his country independent. That friendship had a price, and the price was paid in Nepali blood. The Ranas turned Gurkha soldiers into one of the British Empire's most valuable exports. When rebellion erupted across India in 1857, Jung Bahadur personally marched troops down to help the British crush it, and was rewarded with a chunk of territory back in the Terai lowlands. And when the great wars of the 20th century came, the Gurkhas came with them. In the First World War, more than 50,000 Gurkhas fought for Britain, and around 20,000 of them were killed or wounded in the mud of places most had never heard of. In the Second World War, over 110,000 served across Africa, Italy, Greece, and the jungles of Southeast Asia. Tens of thousands more casualties, dozens of Victoria Crosses, a staggering blood debt paid by farm boys from villages that had never seen a paved road. And that's the grim irony sitting at the heart of the Rana century. All that money, all that martial glory, all those subsidies flowing back from Britain, where did it go? Into the family. The Ranas built themselves a fantasy version of Europe right there in the Kathmandu Valley. Enormous, gleaming, white neoclassical palaces with Corinthian columns and Palladian facades, imported crystal chandeliers, marble floors and silver furniture. The crown jewel was Singha Durbar, thrown up in 1908, reportedly with something like 1,700 rooms spread across a maze of courtyards, a palace so absurdly grand it looked like Versailles had a baby with a wedding cake. There were ballrooms with mirrors imported at ruinous expense, private lakes, marble staircases, the works. Meanwhile, a few miles away, ordinary Nepalis lived in a country with almost no schools, almost no hospitals, almost no roads, and almost no idea that the modern world even existed. The family at the top was drowning in chandeliers. The family at the bottom was drowning, full stop. If you ever want a tidy visual definition of the word inequality, it is one clan hoarding 1,700 rooms, while the people who feed them share one. Because that was the whole strategy: isolation. The Ranas figured out very quickly that the most dangerous thing you can give an oppressed population is information, so they simply refused to let any in. They sealed Nepal off from the outside world like a jar of pickles. No foreign visitors without permission, no newspapers stirring up trouble, no schools teaching peasants to read documents about their own rights. To be fair, and we should be fair, occasionally, even to autocrats, a few reforms did trickle out. Prime Minister Chandra Shumsher, the man who built Singha Durbar, formally abolished the practice of sati, the ritual burning of widows, in 1920, and abolished slavery a few years after that. Progress. Just, progress rationed out one royal decree at a time by the family that owned the entire country. But you cannot keep a jar sealed forever, and the thing that finally cracked it was education specifically. The education happening just across the border. Young Nepalis kept slipping down into British India to study, and in India they encountered something intoxicating and dangerous. The whole roaring anti-colonial independence movement, Gandhi and Nehru, and the idea that ordinary people might actually get a say in how they're governed. These students came home with their heads full of democracy and their pockets full of pamphlets, and they started to organise. Out of exile and agitation, an opposition finally took shape, the Nepali Congress, a party explicitly dedicated to the radical notion that the Rana family did not, in fact, personally own 5.5 million human beings. Then the ground shifted underneath the Ranas entirely. In 1947, the British packed up and left India for good, and the Ranas suddenly realised their whole survival strategy cozy up to the imperial superpower next door had a fatal flaw, which is that the imperial superpower next door had just ceased to exist. In its place was a brand new independent India, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, a man who had spent his life fighting exactly the kind of hereditary autocracy the Ranas represented, and who felt precisely zero sentimental attachment to a family of Himalayan strongmen. The Ranas had spent a century being the last men standing. Now they were just the last men. And the whole board was about to flip. The endgame came fast, and it came from an unexpected direction, the puppet king himself. In November of 1950, King Tribhuvan, the Shah monarch the Ranas, had kept as a caged ceremonial figurehead his entire life, made his move. He climbed into a car under the pretense of a hunting trip, drove straight to the Indian embassy, claimed asylum, and then flew to Delhi. The Ranas, scrambling, tried to save the system by crowning Tribhuvan's 4-year-old grandson, a little boy named Gyanendra, as the new king. It was a farce, and Nehru's India refused to recognise it. Meanwhile, the Nepali Congress launched an armed revolt, seizing towns across the southern plains, and suddenly the family that had ruled through fear for 100 years discovered that fear only works until people stop being afraid. By early 1951 it was over. Under intense Indian pressure, the three sides, the exiled king, the rebels, and the cornered Ranas, hammered out a deal in Delhi, and on the 18th of February, King Tribhuvan flew home to Kathmandu, restored to real power, and announced the end of Rana rule to cheering crowds. 105 years of family autocracy, snuffed out. The doors of the sealed jar were flung open, and the outside world came pouring in journalists, aid workers, mountaineers, ideas, all of it. Nepal was suddenly, dizzyingly, free. Which meant, of course, that Nepal now faced the second hardest thing a nation can do, after overthrowing a tyrant. It had to figure out what on earth to do next, and that, as we're about to find out, would prove to be a spectacular mess. Chapter 6. The Modern Republic. So here you are, standing in the wreckage of a tyranny, holding the keys to a country nobody has actually been allowed to run in over a century. It's a strange feeling. For 104 years the Ranas did all the deciding, and now, suddenly, the deciding is yours. And it turns out that a nation which has spent generations being told exactly what to do does not automatically know what to do the moment it's handed the wheel. Nepal in the early 1950s had freedom, a restored king, a handful of eager political parties, and absolutely no working machinery for turning any of that into a functioning government. It was like being given a beautiful sports car with no engine, no manual, and 3 different people insisting they're the driver. The 1950s were, to put it kindly, a mess. Governments formed and collapsed with the reliability of a cheap umbrella. King Tribhuvan died in 1955, and his son Mahendra took the throne, a quiet, watchful man who wore sunglasses indoors and clearly had opinions. In 1959, Nepal finally held its first proper general election, and the Nepali Congress won a genuine landslide. A man named BP Koirala became the country's first elected prime minister. Real democracy, actual ballots, people choosing their own leaders for the first time in the history of the place. It was a genuinely hopeful moment, the kind of thing you'd expect to see on a commemorative postage stamp. It lasted about 18 months. Because King Mahendra, watching from behind those sunglasses, decided he didn't much care for sharing power with elected politicians. In December of 1960, he staged what can only be described as a royal coup against his own government. He dismissed Koirala, threw him in prison, suspended the brand new constitution, and banned every political party in the country. Just like that, the great democratic experiment was over, and in its place Mahendra built something he called the Panchayat system, a partyless democracy, which is one of those phrases that falls apart the second you look at it directly, like jumbo shrimp or working from home. It was democracy with the democracy carefully removed, and the king left standing in the middle of it. The Panchayat system ran the country for the next 30 years, and its whole logic was that Nepal didn't need messy competing parties because it had a king to unify everyone. Mahendra leaned hard on 3 pillars: the Hindu religion, the Nepali language, and the monarchy itself, and pushed the slogan, "One language, one dress," which is a lovely bit of branding until you remember that Nepal is home to something like 125 languages and dozens of distinct peoples who did not, in fact, all wear the same thing. It was tidy on paper and deeply awkward in practice. Mahendra died in 1972, and his son Birendra inherited both the crown and the increasingly threadbare fiction that a party-free monarchy was what everyone secretly wanted. They did not, as it happens, secretly want that. By 1990, the pressure had built to the point of eruption. The Nepali Congress joined forces with a coalition of leftist parties, and together they launched the Jana Andolan, the People's Movement. Picture the streets of Kathmandu filling with people who'd spent their entire lives under royal rule chanting for the right to simply choose their own government. There were strikes, there were curfews, there were clashes with police that turned bloody, and after weeks of it, King Birendra, to his considerable credit, when you look at how these things usually go, blinked. In April he lifted the ban on political parties. By November there was a new constitution that turned him into a constitutional monarch, the kind who reigns but doesn't rule, and handed real power back to the people. So Nepal got its democracy back. Round 2. And here's the uncomfortable truth about the 1990s in Nepal democracy. Once restored, promptly demonstrated that it could be just as chaotic and disappointing as everyone had feared. Governments toppled constantly, coalitions splintered over petty grievances, corruption seeped into everything. Out in the hill villages, the poor, remote, forgotten places where a change of government in Kathmandu felt about as relevant as weather on the moon. Nothing improved. No roads. No schools worth the name. No sense that this shiny new democracy had anything to offer them at all. And into that vacuum, into that pool of rural rage and neglect, stepped a group of people with a very different idea about how to fix things. In February of 1996, a faction of hardline communists, calling themselves the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, declared a people's war. Their goal was simple and enormous: tear down the monarchy, tear down the whole system, and build a people's republic in its place. They started small, with attacks on rural police posts, and over the next decade they grew into a genuine insurgency controlling great swathes of the countryside. What followed was a civil war that ground on for 10 brutal years and killed somewhere between 13 and 17,000 people. Villagers caught between Maoist fighters and government soldiers, each side convinced the other was the enemy. It was the kind of slow, grinding tragedy that rarely makes international headlines, but reshapes a country entirely from the inside out. And then, in the middle of all this, came the single most shocking night in modern Nepali history, a story so lurid it sounds invented. On the 1st of June, 2001, the royal family gathered for a private dinner at the Narayan Shah Palace in Kathmandu. Crown Prince Dipendra, the heir to the throne, 29 years old, had been drinking heavily and, by most accounts, was furious. He was in love with a young woman his mother had firmly refused to let him marry over the tangled politics of her family background. At some point that evening, Dipendra left the room, changed into military fatigues, returned carrying an armful of guns, and opened fire on his own family. When it was over, King Birendra was dead. So was Queen Aishwarya. So were Dipendra's brother, his sister, and several other members of the royal family, 9 people in all, an entire branch of a dynasty erased in a matter of minutes. And then, in a final twist so grim it borders on the absurd, Dipendra turned a gun on himself. He didn't die immediately. He slipped into a coma, and because Nepali law is Nepali law, the man who had just slaughtered the king was technically next in line. So for 3 surreal days, Nepal had a comatose king who was also the murderer of the previous king. Dipendra died on the 4th of June without ever waking up, having reigned over a country he never once saw as its monarch. The throne then passed to Birendra's younger brother, a man you already know, because he'd been a child king once before, briefly, decades earlier, when the Ranas were playing their games. Gyanendra. He had not been at the dinner that night, which spared his life and, inevitably, fueled 1,000 conspiracy theories that follow him around to this day. Whatever the truth of it, Gyanendra took the crown of a country that was already fighting a civil war, already exhausted, and now traumatized on top of everything else. And Gyanendra, it turned out, had inherited more than the throne. He'd inherited a bit of his grandfather Mahendra's taste for direct rule. In February of 2005, Gyanendra made his move. He dismissed the government, declared a state of emergency, cut the phone lines, arrested politicians, and seized absolute power for himself, a full-blown royal takeover, the kind Nepal thought it had left behind in 1990. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, because instead of scaring people into submission, it did the one thing nobody expected. It drove the mainstream political parties and the Maoist rebels, sworn enemies who'd been killing each other for nearly a decade, straight into each other's arms. Faced with a king trying to turn back the clock, they decided they had a common problem, and it was wearing a crown. So in April of 2006 came the Second People's Movement Jana Andolan II, and this one was bigger, angrier, and utterly unstoppable. For 19 days, the entire country simply shut down. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded the streets day after day, refusing to go home. Gyanendra tried curfews. He tried the army. None of it worked. And on the 24th of April, cornered and out of options, the king went on television and gave the power back, reinstating the parliament he'd dissolved. Months later, the government and the Maoists signed a comprehensive peace accord, and the 10-year civil war finally, mercifully, came to an end. The guns went quiet. The rebels came down from the hills and picked up ballots instead. Then came the reckoning for the monarchy itself. In 2008, Nepal elected a constituent assembly, and at its very first sitting it did something the country had never done in 240 years. It abolished the crown. The Shah dynasty, the line that stretched all the way back to Prithvi Narayan, the little kingdom that had swallowed 100 others to build a nation, was simply voted out of existence. Gyanendra was given 15 days to pack up and leave the palace. He walked out an ordinary citizen, and the Narayanhiti Palace, scene of that terrible dinner, became a museum you can pay to walk through today. Nepal was now a federal democratic republic. The mountains had outlasted every last one of its kings. Writing the actual rulebook for this new republic proved almost as hard as winning it. The first Constituent Assembly argued for 4 years and dissolved in 2012 without producing a single agreed constitution. It took a second assembly and a genuine national tragedy to finally force the issue, because on the 25th of April 2015, the ground beneath Nepal did what it has always eventually done. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake, the Gorkha quake, tore through the country, killing around 9,000 people, injuring 100,000 more, and flattening ancient temples and entire hillside villages in a matter of seconds. Remember, right back at the beginning, how we talked about these mountains still being built, the Indian plate still shoving north, the whole region a slow-motion collision zone. This was that collision cashing in. The Earth simply remembered what it was. In the wreckage of that disaster, the squabbling politicians finally found the will to agree, and in September of 2015, Nepal adopted its long-awaited constitution, a federal structure of 7 provinces and hundreds of local governments. It wasn't perfect. Groups in the southern plains felt shut out, and their protests, plus a punishing border blockade from India, choked the country's fuel supply for months. Which brings us, at the very end, back to a phrase we met long ago. Prithvi Narayan once called Nepal a yam between 2 boulders squeezed forever between the giants of India and China. And that, more than anything, is still the story of Nepal today. A small, proud, mountainous republic performing an endless, delicate balancing act between 2 enormous neighbours, playing them off, leaning on each, belonging fully to neither. And modern Nepal? It's a country that exports, more than anything else, its own people. Something like a quarter of the entire economy is money sent home by Nepalists working abroad on Gulf construction sites, in Malaysian factories, in kitchens and warehouses half a world away, millions of them, sending their wages back to families in the hills. Meanwhile, the mountains that built the whole story draw the rest of the world in. Trekkers, climbers, the endless human parade toward Everest, the highest point on the planet, sitting right there on the border. There's hydropower in all that falling water and promise in all that stone. But for now, the story of Nepal is still, quietly, the story of its land. And that, my friend, is where we'll leave it, because if you strip away the kings and the coups, the massacres and the movements, the empires and the earthquakes, what you're left with is this a ribbon of impossible country folded up against the roof of the world, where the ground is still rising, grain by grain, year by year, pushed skyward by forces that were here long before the first Shah, and will be here long after the last remittance is wired home. The mountains don't care who governs the valleys. They just keep growing, slowly, in the dark. So wherever you are tonight, however tangled your own small kingdom feels, let it go for now. Rest easy. The peaks are keeping watch, the way they always have. Sleep well,